So we were talking about E.D. Hirsch. And who is E.D. Hirsch? An American hermeneutist. That means a critic who is talking about literature and using the methods of hermeneutics to approach works of literature to answer some basic questions like what is the meaning of a work, like what is the intention behind a particular work, like what is the genre of a particular work, and all related questions. He made a distinction between intention of a work and significance of a work that I explained to you in the last session. There are also other things about his work. He also wanted readers and critics to pay attention to the intrinsic genre of a work. When I say intrinsic genre of a work, means some basic idea about the genre. A work may be an epic, and as an epic, it will follow certain conventions. A work may be a poem, and as a poem, it will follow certain conventions. A work may be a play, and it will follow the conventions of a play. There can be a blurring of boundaries also in many cases. Say, before novel writing proper began, there were many works which can also qualify as novels. What is the status of Pilgrim's Progress, for example? So here, E.D. Hirsch is talking about the intrinsic genre of a work. That means try to see, discover, look at the intrinsic genre of a work. There are some other terms also which are relevant in our discussion of E.D. Hirsch. He tries to establish a kind of typology of meaning. He also tries to follow certain general conventions. General conventions. Say, literature or writing literature is a very conventional kind of activity. You write a poem and you follow certain conventions. You write an epic and you follow certain conventions. So in all this, his worry was that there should be some certainty about meaning, some stability about meaning. You see the link between Husserl's philosophy and E.D. Hirsch's approach. What was Husserl interested in? We cannot be sure about the meaning of all those objects which exist in the world, but we can be sure how those objects appear to our consciousness. We can know something about their universal nature, their essence. So something of that essence can also be seen in E.D. Hirsch's criticism. There is a work, there is some kind of essence of that work, some kind of probable meaning of that work, some intrinsic genre of that work. We cannot be 100% sure about the meaning, but we can be pretty sure about the probable meaning. So the link between the philosophy of Husserl and literary criticism of E.D. Hirsch. There you had the essence of objects as they appear to an individual's consciousness. And here we look at the meaning, and in this case, probable meaning of a particular work. Husserl was interested in some kind of stability in an atmosphere of uncertainty. He was interested in discovering some certainty in an atmosphere when everything was uncertain. And here, E.D. Hirsch is also interested in discovering some kind of certainty about the meaning of a work. So certainty is important for Husserl, and certainty is also important for E.D. Hirsch. He was especially very critical of the approach of a critic like Gadamer, Hans Gadamer, who we will discuss next. Because if we followed somebody like Gadamer, then a literary work will mean something today and something else maybe tomorrow, and maybe a few days later something entirely different. So Husserl was interested in certainty in the world, in discovering certainty, and here E.D. Hirsch is also interested in some kind of certainty about the probable meaning of a work. You can say that he appears very authoritative, E.D. Hirsch. You can say that he wants to dominate meaning, control meaning. Oh, this is the meaning. And you can ask this question, how can we be sure even about the probable meaning? That means if we are not sure about the real meaning, how can we be sure even about the probable meaning? And Husserl, sorry, E.D. Hirsch is saying that we are not talking about meaning which is very certain, but probable meaning. Next, we have Gadamer, and obviously E.D. Hirsch had Gadamer in his mind when he was talking about the stable meaning or some kind of stability as far as meaning of a work is concerned. Gadamer, as I said earlier, is influenced by Heidegger. And you know that Heidegger talked about being in the world. World is important. The sign is important. Our existence in the world is important for Heidegger. And here for Gadamer, whose most famous work was Truth and Method. What is he saying? That the meaning of a work is not exhausted by the intention of the author. That means whatever be the intention of a writer, when he is writing something, meaning goes beyond that writer's intention. Suppose a writer wants to write a work which is about life of birds. That is his intention. But what happens when readers read that work in a different context? They say that it is not about birds, but rather it is about human beings' existence. It is allegorical. It is hardly about birds. So whatever be the original intention of a writer, a work is, or its meaning is not actually exhausted by the intention. So that means these are two different things. Intention of a writer, but the critic looking at intention but going beyond that intention. Then important thing here is that new meanings come up. New meanings arise in a new context. And here we are somewhat close to E.D. Hirsch's idea of significance. New meanings come. In a different context, new meanings arise. But important thing is that all interpretation is historically relative. That means we are going back to Heidegger's idea where he's saying about, he's talking about our existence in the world, that we and our world, they are related. And here a particular work and the world in which it is read, that becomes important. So that means all interpretations of past literature, arise from a dialogue between past and present. There is a work which is written in 18th century. We are reading that work in 21st century. We are reading that work from the vantage point of 21st century. We are raising some questions which are relevant to us. And in that respect, history, historical movement, and our movement, they somehow relate. There is a dialogue between past and present. So maybe it is an old work, maybe it is a work which was written in the 18th century, but when we are reading that work, we see that there is a dialogue between past and present. So past is understood through the vantage point of present, and present is seen, looked at through the perspective of the past. And there is this dialogue between past and present. This dialogue can also be seen in the interpretation of works which were written earlier. What we see here, we see a critic, Gadamer, who is taking his ideas, or who is inspired by the ideas of Heidegger. And Gadamer also had a certain view of tradition. Now the question arises, okay, we are looking at a particular work in 21st century, and we have certain notions about literature, and we begin that work with those notions. There is a word for that. We start reading a work with a kind of pre-understanding. If I am reading a work, are you following me? Just raise your hand. Just raise your hand. Okay. So we have a particular kind of pre-understanding. We have some prejudice. We have some ideas with which we begin reading a work. But Gadamer is not worried about those ideas. He's saying that even those ideas with which we begin reading a work, they are part of a tradition. They're part of a tradition. That means certain ideas were relevant in 18th century and certain other ideas were relevant in 19th century. And then there is a kind of carryover of those ideas in 20th and 21st. But because those ideas are part of tradition, so our interpretation of that work will not be spoiled by our prejudices. And prejudice or our prejudices become something positive. Something positive. So to just sum up some of the ideas of Gadamer. For him, a work establishes a dialogue between past and present. For him, our prejudices with which we start reading a work, these prejudices are positive things rather than negative things. For him, there is a kind of continuing running tradition. And here some criticism is also there of this idea that for Gadamer, the tradition is that high tradition of German art. This is not a tradition which takes into account work or artifacts produced by lesser mortals, but rather it is a high classical German tradition. And Gadamer, you know that he was influenced by Heidegger. And here we see that after Gadamer, there is another very important line in German criticism. And you know that this entire school is very heavily biased in favor of ideas which come from Germany. And what is the other current? What is the other trend? What is the other dimension of this whole approach? That is called German reception theory. German reception theory. One important practitioner of German reception theory also joked about this, that please do not think that we are talking about hotel management when we are talking about German reception theory. No, we are not talking about hotel management. We are talking about reception of works of literature. And you know that this is there in your notes also, which I have posted on your WhatsApp page. German reception theory is influenced by Gadamer. But one important difference is there. You see, in classical hermeneutics, I'm sorry, past works were important, old works were important. And many critics who are inspired by, influenced by hermeneutics, for them also old works, classical works, works of an earlier period, they were important. But for German reception theory, even current works are important. That means the study of reception of the works is not necessarily the study of works which were written in distant past, but rather they can be works written in the same century. So reception theory also shares a common ground with reader response criticism. We have come across reader response criticism. So let us just talk about some differences. Reader response criticism is an umbrella term where you have critics talking about the role of a reader, but critics are coming from different theoretical approaches. Somebody may be a feminist critic, but because that feminist critic puts a female reader at the center of her enterprise, and so her work also qualifies as an example of reader response criticism. Somebody may be a structuralist critic, but because he's talking about a reader, so there also you can say that his work can qualify as reader response criticism. Similarly, there are critics who come from psychology background or from the background of deconstruction. So that way, reader response criticism draws its practitioners from different theoretical approaches, and so reader response criticism becomes a kind of umbrella term. Reception, German reception theory is also an umbrella term, but German reception theory is more cohesive in nature. And here you have mostly critics who come from one particular university in Germany. And what is that university in Germany? That is University of Constance. University of Constance. And that's why it is also called, say, Constance School of Criticism. They were writing mostly in 1960s. So we see the difference. Whereas reader response criticism is an umbrella term which draws its practitioners, its critics from different schools. German reception theory is more cohesive, based on the works of critics who were writing in 60s, and most of these critics were working in the University of Constance. Now, one very important name here, and this is the name of Robert Hans Joss. Robert Hans Joss. He's an important name in German reception theory. Joss is identified with one particular concept. That concept is horizon of expectations. And he also borrows one idea from a scientist, T.S. Kuhn, his concept of paradigm. So you see that Kuhn's idea of paradigm, Kuhn, Kuhn, this is the name of the scientist, Kuhn. His idea of paradigm is employed, is adapted by Joss to talk about his concept of horizon of expectations. Now, what is this idea of paradigm? And Joss also explains this idea of paradigm. In different periods in the history of science, there are different frameworks of knowledge. There are different ways to create knowledge. There are different assumptions with which we create knowledge. So if maybe in the 18th century, there was a particular kind of paradigm in which all knowledge was created, it is not necessary that in 20th century the same paradigm will be used. the same framework will be used. Rather, a different framework is used to understand things, to create knowledge. One major example is that we had a particular conception of our universe earlier, a particular conception of our world. The world is flat. Maybe if one goes too far in one's voyage, one may fall from a particular point in water. This was an idea, this was an assumption, but later this gave way to a different nature of the world. So you have a Copernican system, but you also had Galileo. You had many such important names where they talked about the nature of our world. And similarly, if you look at the history of medicine, there was a time when those four humors were considered important. Four humors which represented four different kinds of temperaments of people. We no longer talk about those four humors. So it means that in different periods in history, there are different paradigms, and these paradigms help us arrive at knowledge in different ways. And the paradigm of a particular age is not necessarily followed by another age. So 19th century offered a different paradigm, and 20th may be different. And 21st century will discover its own paradigm. Now this idea is related to Joss's idea of horizon of expectations. That means a work also appears in a particular horizon of expectations. A work also appears in the context of a storehouse of ideas. The work also appears in a climate of certain ideas. And then there is also a particular kind of climate in which readers operate. So work has a certain horizon of expectations, and readers also have a particular horizon of expectations. Readers in 20th century, early 20th century had a different horizon of expectations, and reader maybe in 21st century have different horizon of expectations. Let us see some examples which he mentions. He said that there was a time early on in the history of criticism, and this is what Joss is mentioning, where we followed a kind of classical humanist model of scholarship. Classical humanist model of scholarship, where human concerns, human values, human aspects of a work were considered very important. That if there is a work, what is the human significance of that work? Now, gradually, that human significance of the work or classical humanist model, classical humanist paradigm, classical humanist horizon of expectations gave way to another paradigm in which works were understood. And what was that paradigm? Where historicist and positivist paradigm. That means earlier, if somebody just read a work, one was not interested in the history of that work. One was interested in deriving some kind of human lessons from the work. But later, not human lessons, but rather a study of the sources of that work, a study of the context in which that work was produced. And you have a very good amount of scholarship, a very, say, number of books written on this particular subject, how sources of a work can be traced. So take the example of Shakespeare. One can say that, okay, Lady Macbeth is a very interesting study of jealousy, and Macbeth is a very interesting study of ambition, and ambition is all that is there about Hamlet, an ambition is all which is there about Macbeth, or say Hamlet is a person who thinks too much. It means we are talking about the human significance. But this method of scholarship gave way to another method of scholarship, and what was this? Historicist and positivist. And in this context, we see that okay, Hamlet was written. When was Hamlet written? Okay, it was written in this particular age. How do you know that this was written at this particular time? And then we start looking at some of the sources. We think, oh, Shakespeare also had a son. His name was this, and probably Hamlet is a portrait of this particular person. And then we look at some other historical references. We try to work out those historical references. That means our entire focus is on discovering sources of that work. And what is that paradigm? Historicist positivist paradigm. But gradually, even historicist positivist paradigm gave way to a new paradigm, to a different horizon of expectations. If you look at the criticism produced by new critics or many other critics in 20th century, mid 20th century, then they became interested in the form of the work. Russian formalism, form of the work. New criticism, form of the work. Music of the words. Images which are used in the work. Metaphors which are used in the work. A sense of unity which one can discover after reading those images. The form of the work. That means that formal aspect, that aesthetic aspect. Okay, this is the aesthetics of this work. This gives us this kind of pleasure. This pleases us. When we discuss somebody like James Joyce, and James Joyce talks about his aesthetic theory, that is the aesthetic dimension. And when we look at a particular work, we see that this is the form of the work. And here we are not interested in the historical question. We are not interested in sources. We are not interested in the human significance. We are interested in the devices which are used in a work, that is there in Russian formalism. What are the devices which make art art? Russian formalism. What are the devices which are used by a poet to impart a sense of unity to a poem? New criticism. Study of cadence, study of metaphor, study of rhythm, study of imagery, study of figures of speech, study of rhetorical devices. All these are formal questions. Study of structure of a work, study of syntax, study of plot, study of the relationship between plot and story. These are all formal questions. So aesthetic and formalist paradigm was another paradigm. And you see that now we are studying a very different paper. So with the coming of new theories from 1960s onwards, new paradigms emerged. So he borrows a concept from one scientist, T.S. Kuhn, his concept of paradigm, and he adapts that concept to his concept, which is known as horizon of expectations. A work appears in a particular horizon of expectations, and it is also read in a particular horizon of expectations. And we saw that how even a very short history of criticism in 20th century can show us different horizons of expectations. And that means the meaning of a work is not fixed. Gadamer talking about past and present. A work is a dialogue between past and present. And Joss, who is influenced by Gadamer, is also talking about this fact that the meaning of a work is not fixed. It is not like a monument. So for example, you see a monument, you see Mount Everest, and Mount Everest possibly appears in the same shape to people in 1950 and maybe people in the 21st century. A work offers different faces to readers in different times, and hence the meaning of a work is not fixed. I hope you are getting this. Okay, so here we are now. After discussing Robert Hens Joss, we can also talk about the work of some other critics who took up this line, but they offered new insights. And I'll mention one very important name. He also comes from this University of Constance. He also belongs to Constance School of Reception Aesthetics, Reception Theory. His name is Wolfgang Isser. If you remember, I also gave you an article by Isser. It is from his book. The article is titled, he is talking about a work and he's talking about phenomenological approach to reading. If you can read just 3-4 pages of that article closely and maybe just browse the remaining pages, you'll have a fair idea about what Isser is up to. So Isser is an important name, but I don't think I should talk about Isser in this session. It has become too intense. Maybe we'll require another session with you, and there we'll just complete our discussion of phenomenology. I already met you in the classroom in the Faculty of Arts, discussed many of these things, but of course today we discussed something new. We discussed Gadamer, we discussed German reception theory, and we also tried to revise our ideas of some earlier theories like Husserl and Heidegger. So I'm going to unmute you now so that you can make your comments, right? And first of all, tell me whether this experience was good or bad. I'm sure that this experience was not bad. It was wonderful seeing you, but there are many other names I see on the screen: Seher Salim, Isha Gotwal, or Afrin Khan, Huda Khan. Actually, it looks good if we see each other. That gives us a very real kind of experience. So, for example, if I see Abdul Qayyum, I can also read his face expressions, and I can see that Ihsanul Haq is very, very, say, serious about this particular class. He's also smiling. I mean, I know that there are those facial expressions. And when I talked about Lady Macbeth and how Abid smiled, those are, they make this class a real class, right? So I'm going to unmute you for a while. Yeah. There will be some noise, I'm sure, but still for 2-3 minutes we can bear this noise here. Yes, Ehsan, would you like to say something?
Yes, sir. This is pretty much same as that of structuralism, where we cannot understand meaning in independence. When all these things are put together, then meaning is generated.
Ehsan, we'll discuss structuralism in great detail. So actually, this is there may be some common ground between different approaches, but structuralism is a lot different. In structuralism, human subject is not important at all. Subject is liquidated, say just thrown away, and here human subject is important. So we'll come back to this particular point. Yes, yes, Abid, what do you say? Okay, Madina would like to say something. Madina, or is it? Are you?
Hello.
Yeah. You're saying something, Madiha? Ayum? Anything? He's not there. Ayum. Abid? Yes.
No, sir, I don't have anything to say.
Just something. Not necessarily about the class. Anything?
The class was very good.
Sir, will post carries over the group?
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that. I've done the recording.
Well, today's your voice was much clearer. We had many classes on Zoom, but today your voice was much clearer.
Okay, you had another class also, something? Somebody?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We had with Sadaf ma'am, but today your voice is much clearer than her.
Okay.
Sir, is there any final meaning? How we can reach to the final meaning if meaning is probable?
It's a good question. So I'm going to unmute you for 1 minute, and then after it will go off. This is an interesting question. So just to answer this question, I have to unmute you. I'm going to mute you. I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. Yes.
This is a very interesting question. Is there any final meaning? Can we have one final opinion, one definitive opinion, one authoritative opinion, one opinion which is unmistakable about the meaning of a work? Well, it is an interesting question, but the answer is no. And why is the answer no? And here quickly I must make 2 points. One is that in different ways there have been different nails. So for example, one particular school comes with one nail. Okay, I am fixing this nail and this is the meaning. So phenomenology was maybe just one nail. And then came structuralism. Structuralism said that, oh, this is how we arrive at the meaning. Another nail. And then, of course, you see that later feminism came up with something, or post-structuralism came up with something. They said that this is another nail. So as far as meaning of a work is concerned, there is always a possibility of different interpretations, and you have different nails.